Okay, thank you, English department, English faculty, English students in our room and online who are here today. We're super excited to welcome you, and we are also recording this so that we can use this for the future as well. So that folks who can't make it can then rewatch and see what our faculty are about. But we thought that we would put together a session so that students you could meet, physically or figuratively meet our faculty members and hear about their research and a little bit about like what their research process is and whatnot. Um, so today what I imagined is that we can kind of just go around and talk like for about 5 minutes, very briefly, about what our areas of research are and like what our passion is. And so I'll start with Emily, and then I'll call the Zoom folks, and then I'll finish up with myself too, for those who aren't familiar with me. So first we will talk to Professor Hoover here.
Hi, everyone.
Tell us about your work.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Emily Hoover. I am a senior lecturer of English. I teach first year composition here. I also teach and coordinate the creative writing minor. And I work in literature and literary theory as well. Something that I'm interested in, like, first of all, I want to speak to kind of the imposter syndrome question that you floated around, Dr. P. So I don't have a PhD. Right? I have a Master of Fine Arts. So I'll say that I struggle with imposter syndrome a lot because I often find that folks believe creative writing is just for fun and that what we're doing is just like sitting somewhere like a meadow or a coffee shop and just writing our feelings or our experiences, right? So there's a lot more to it than that. Obviously, those of you who've studied with me or others in creative writing, there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm really interested in my work, how we can ask similar research questions that we would ask maybe in qualitative research or applying a theoretical lens, right, to a piece of literature, how we can ask those questions and answer them in creative writing. So I'm often interested in what's being centered in our society, whether that's around language or around certain practices. And I like to answer those questions oftentimes in fiction, because if you know anything about fiction, there's a lot to do with tension and conflict, and often resolutions that are not super neat. There's often a lot of complexities there, right? And art mirrors our world. So in projects I've done with students have been oftentimes creative, especially in the honors thesis realm, but we always have a critical introduction that involves a lot of qualitative research. So usually interviewing folks, doing field observations, maybe having like a little focus group of folks, and beginning to understand what telling a story means or what writing a poem means, especially if you're outside of your experience, outside of your identities. So with authenticity in mind. So that's kind of what I'm interested in. And for those of you who know me, I often will take some of those things into composition classes that I teach, but also literature and literary theory classes. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Joanna Shearer, would you like to go next?
I'd be delighted to go next. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Joanna Shearer. I'm, I don't know even, maybe I'm having my own identity crisis. So I've been teaching so many things for so long. But my scholarly area of expertise is late medieval literature, particularly British literature, and then my secondary area is gender and sexuality and lit class studies. So in particular, looking at rape culture. So when I read or analyze the very oldest, deadest of white men, I like to ask them really uncomfortable questions about women's sexuality and agency and consent and all of those things. So I also teach a number of the queer lit classes, gender and sexuality in lit. I've taught women in literature before. Of course, composition and things like that. But the non-medieval British literature class this semester, I'm teaching ancient literature or literature of the ancient world, sorry. So in essence, I like to have a lot of contemporary. I'm not a comparative lit scholar. I've kind of become one over time, but I do like to look at contemporary media in relation to really old and ancient texts, just because I think students are always shocked to realize that while technology is better, people are largely unchanged, even from 3 millennia ago, which is both comforting and terrifying at the same time. So yeah, that's where, and honestly, the way I approach projects like this and working with students is really starting from the core of what you love to do and kind of figuring out how to make that into a project. The beauty of this is it's finally something that you get to research and that you want to research and that you want to talk about, and not just sort of an assignment. So even if you come in with a preconceived notion that, you know, you want to talk about Emily Dickinson, or you feel like you have to, or whatever, I'll probably start with the question of, do you actually want to talk about Emily Dickinson, or is there something else that you really love? And so I've worked with students on a broad range of projects, including his Mortal Instruments series, film series. I had a student who worked with the Iliad and told a beautiful narrative about their relationship with their father and looked at masculinity and fatherhood. So it's kind of it can have a wide range, and I'm just there to guide. You're really driving the project, and so that's where that's my starting point for working with any student.
Awesome. Okay. Bree, would you like to go next?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I am Bree Termina Barrientos. And I am composition coordinator in the department, and I teach various writing studies classes. My field of research in particular is kind of the intersection of writing and identity. With a specific focus on linguistic justice and linguistic racism research. Those are kind of the things that I study on my own. I am also a PhD student over at UNLV. Shout out to Emily. I also have a non-PhD imposter syndrome. But let's see, what do I feel comfortable directing? I feel comfortable directing anything as related to writing and the writing process, particularly related to writing instruction. So my background is in English literature, actually, but I kind of fell in love with Rhet Comp writing studies when I was in my master's program. And now I am studying education and literacy education. So I think anything related to those fields is of particular interest to me. I have worked on projects related to a number of things. I've had multiple multimodal projects. I have anything that relates to writing and identity, writing processes, how identity shapes our writing, those kind of things I've worked on pretty regularly. Um, I did kind of want to touch a little bit on, because the rest of you kind of covered the other things, that when to let go of a project question. I think that Emily and I had conversations about this quite a lot last semester when it came to honors theses, is that at some point you have to recognize that it's okay to not be finished with it. That an incomplete project is completely fine as long as we're meeting those goals and we're learning from our research. Like, that's the reason we do research. So I'm a qualitative researcher, but I do have a little bit of a quantitative background as well. So if you're learning something, even if it didn't turn out how you expected it to, it's okay to kind of accept defeat is the wrong word in that situation, but more like a project is still good incomplete if it didn't end up where you wanted it to be. You can still publish that and you can still learn from it. So I think that that's kind of how I focus my research. I also I don't really know that I have like a traditional starting point. I like to start with like the literature review in particular, because that's where we learn all of our information, contextualize it, and then build research and research questions from there.
So yeah, that's all I got. Yeah. Like Joanna said, at some point you have to stop researching and start writing.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
students, even I don't take this advice myself either. It's like you feel like you have to read all the things before you can start writing. At some point, you just have to start
Yep.
writing.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And just for the record for the recording, the questions that I had given the faculty in advance are the following, just that they're kind of thinking about these, and we can ask these again during the session. Number one, what's your field of research? What are you passionate about? What type of project do you feel comfortable directing? Right, for the honors projects. Two, how do you approach a research project? Or really, I should have said research or creative project, like a project. Where do you start? Three, how do you know when to let go of a project? When do you know it's done? Four, how do you approach and complete a literature review? Any advice? Five, how do you pace yourself with larger research projects? Again, that could be larger projects. Six, how do you combat imposter syndrome and find self-belief? And seven, any other general advice, right? Like kind of left that open. So I just wanted to read through those before we move to Professor Varga.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Varga, and I've been teaching here for the past 3 years. I teach anything from American to British literature, African American literature, Native American literature, diaspora studies, and immigrant literature, ethnic American. I specialized in 20th and 21st century literature for my PhD. And related to this is also something I wanted to say about imposter syndrome, which is that, as you can tell, English is not my first language. You know, I come from another culture. I have a different native language. And so for me, it's always been about, well, how can you teach English literature as a non-native speaker? And how can you teach composition? You know, how can you teach students about writing papers if your native language is not English? And I think this is what stirred me towards doing a research and a degree in comparative literature and being really interested in working in more than one culture and working with you know, different texts in different languages, and also different cultural contexts and literary contexts, and learning about them and how they relate to each other. So I've also become very interested in things like translation and translation theory, and I also teach creative writing. I specialize in fiction and creative nonfiction, so memoir, but also film and screenwriting. And so, yeah, imposter syndrome is kind of related to my studies in many ways. And I'm also always interested in projects that are kind of multicultural, and maybe, you know, refer to even different languages and different historical backgrounds. If I can address the question of how do you pace yourself with larger research projects, and how do you approach and complete a literature review? I've always found research very helpful in getting myself to write by responding to the research that I'm reading. So that for me, that's always been very helpful, and I write along with the texts that I'm reading. If they're critical texts or theoretical texts or primary texts. I do a lot of brainstorming and outlining and reverse outlining. And it's always been, you know, reading other people's research that inspires me to come up with my own ideas about a topic that I'm writing about. I also find it really important to consider research that, kind of goes against the theoretical approach that I'm taking or the arguments that I'm trying to make. So, research the points of view that are different than my own. And this is also something that I really like to consider, and I ask my students to consider to really engage with points of view that they find different and respond to them in strengthening their own arguments. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk more about this, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you guys have.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And for those who don't know me, who will be watching this in the future and, want to know what I'm about, I'm Dr. Leila Pazargadi. I should have introduced myself in the beginning, apologies. And I actually also got my PhD in comparative literature for very similar reasons to Dr. Varga, and that I love this idea of multiple languages and literatures, and not just English lit or something like that, of just one language. And so I worked in English, Persian, and French, also on immigrant narratives. I specialize in autobiographical studies, Middle Eastern lit, post-colonial lit, as my dear students know here. So anything to do with like power and hegemony, I love to see. I also teach a class on comics and have written quite a bit about comics and graphic memoirs, and autobiographies, and a lot of women autobiographical narratives. My area of research has been on Middle Eastern women writing autobiographical material in fiction and nonfiction since 9/11. So I'm using 9/11 as a flashpoint to kind of trace like what has been not just trending, but, kind of like what is an aesthetic, or what are the multiple aesthetics coming out of post 9/11 Middle Eastern women's autobiographical production. So life writing is really interesting for me. And so there are a lot of, intersections, I think, with what Dr. Varga does. I also work on human rights narratives, and there's an intersection there with one of my colleagues who isn't here, Dr. Molly Apple, who also works on all sorts of areas, like human rights narratives, immigrant narratives as well. She also works a lot on South America, like Latin American literature, and we'll be getting a video for her. So just to transition here to folks who aren't here today, and we'll be getting videos from them to post on Canvas, are the aforementioned Dr. Molly Apple, Dr. Laura Decker, the current chair of our department, and Dr. Rachel Herzl Betts, excuse me. I always want to say Best because she's the best, but it's Betts, who will be also providing a video for you guys to get to know us in terms of our research. But, I thought that we'd focus, now that we've kind of gotten introductions out of the way, that we might focus a little bit on process and trying to unpack that a little bit. And anybody can jump in here. And of course, students, think about the questions that you guys have. If you have questions you want to put in the chat, feel free to do so. Feel free to raise your hand, and we can just kind of stop and do, anything and address anything. But I thought one question was like, does a project, first of all, I think we could start out with just like, how does a project start for you, right? Like, what does it begin as? And I'll give you an example of something that kind of struck me, and that was I was reading an interview with Ridley Scott. There's quite a few. I think Gladiator 2 is coming out, and then a couple other films have come out recently from him. And I noticed that a few different interviews, like, he didn't make mention of this, like he had mentioned that he was inspired by a painting. And so the original Gladiator, was inspired by one of the Orientalist painters, Jean-Léon Gérôme. And I can't remember which particular one. And then there was like an older movie that was again inspired by a contemporary artist in London that he had seen in a museum. And so it's really interesting, right? Like, he kind of started with an image, if you think about it. And then he like thought about this image, and then he like started writing the script and the story. And then before you know it, you have like Gladiator 1, and now for better or for worse, Gladiator 2, I don't know. So, you know, for all of us here, like, how does a project start for you? Anyone can go.
I'm happy to jump in. Oh, no, go for it, Bree. I was gonna say, I was waiting for someone to unmute. Please, go ahead, and then I'll go next.
I figured if no one was gonna say anything. No, so mine typically starts with a conversation with you. Like, what are you into? What are you interested in knowing? And usually that leads to some sort of research question. And then that research question is really what drives our research. So from there, we'll start breaking apart like, okay, what kind of foundational theories are important to this particular question? What are some of the assumptions that we have? You know, what are some of the questions we still have? And then from there, you know, we start pouring through the literature and start finding things that are going to support us. They're going to contextualize the conversation. And then as Dr. Scherer said, at some point that does have to stop and we have to actually do the work and do the writing and do the research. And, you know, typically in mine, the research kind of comes at different stages, right? It could be circular. It could come from, you know, qualitative interviews or data sets that you've collected. So yeah, that's kind of what my process looks like.
Yeah, I mean, mine's actually often pretty similar, especially if I'm working on like a book length project. A lot of the time it'll begin with maybe, I don't know, a generative exercise or something that I've written. So there's like maybe one story or poem or something, right? Even if it doesn't quite have a genre yet. And then I'll find myself maybe obsessed with those topics, those themes, and then I'll decide that it's bigger than one item, right? And that's been true with a lot of my work. That was definitely true with a chapbook I published a couple of years ago, and I have another chapbook coming out next year. And all of those started with like really just tiny things that became bigger things. So I'm currently working on a project that's in the very early stages, and I'm really interested in the duplex form, which is a poetic form invented by Jericho Brown. And the form is kind of like if the sonnet, the ghazal, the pantoum, and the blues had a baby.
No.
It's really cool. It's 14 lines. It has a turn, but it's in couplets. And the second line is reimagined as the third line, and the fourth line is reimagined as the fifth line, et cetera, right? So this project began from teaching poetic forms and encouraging my students to understand the conventions associated with those forms, but then break them, right? And the duplex came from that place, right? So many of my students started writing duplexes for this class. And then, of course, you know, I was reading a lot of duplexes as I was teaching it, but at the same time, I was really deep in trauma-informed research, trauma-informed yoga classes and just pedagogy and higher ed and K through 12. So that was like a separate research project connected to self-disclosure, which is also kind of in the infancy stage. So this research project kind of came, and then I hit maybe some roadblocks after the literature review. And I decided that I want to start answering that question through my own duplexes around personal trauma, whether that's trauma I've experienced or maybe trauma I've witnessed. So it's just interesting sometimes to think about, oh, this project fits in a box that is maybe conventionally a research project. And then you can think about maybe other ways to answer those questions. That's not to say that the research project no longer exists, but all of these things kind of work together, and one project feeds another, in other words. So I find that it's really helpful as an artist to do a lot of that, maybe theoretical research, discourse analysis, some of those other things, and then see how that informs my art.
That's awesome. For those who don't know, can you tell us what a chapbook is?
Sure. So chapbook is usually in poetry and fiction, it's usually a work that is shorter. So it's usually between 18 and 35 pages. And some people believe the chapbook is like your debut, you know, like your first EP. But there are other people who believe that, and I'm one of these folks, that the chapbook is the work of the people. It's typically cheaper, it's more accessible, it's often handmade. So there's this really kind of do-it-yourself ethics around chapbooks. This is going to be my third chapbook. My novella, I guess, is a chapbook too. So I really like the chapbook, and I encourage folks to not think of that as like a starting point. There could be a whole career around the chapbook for sure.
Very cool. Very cool. Other faculty want to jump in here?
Sure, I can talk about how I started thinking about a current research project that I've been working on.
Can you
You
just speak
know,
a little bit louder so we can hear you?
yes, and I can turn on. Is this? I don't know if this is better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so.
Yeah, so in light of the 2020 Black Lives Matter and social protests, I just started thinking about how do we think of literature that is Eurocentric and authored by white authors. And one of the authors that I work on is Virginia Woolf, as some of you know. So, to me, it was very interesting that a writer like Toni Morrison wrote her master's thesis on Woolf and Faulkner. And I started looking at this question, and I found that a lot of writers refer to the thesis, but nobody has actually written anything about it and actually looked at the thesis. So I started writing about this literally in about 2020, and I go to conferences and present research as I develop it and get feedback from scholars, from other scholars, which I find really helpful. And so slowly this developed into a larger article that I'm publishing now. And I was really, really interested in what Toni Morrison actually saw in Woolf, and she wrote this thesis at Cornell in the 1950s. So it was a time when Woolf was not regarded as a great canonical feminist as she is today. And yet Morrison compared her to Faulkner, who had just received the Nobel Prize. So it was a really interesting comparison to me. And, it's just strange, quirky questions like this that often guide me to do research that that other people look at things that other scholars perhaps haven't considered before, and that turn out to be very interesting.
Very- Thank you. I appreciate it. And like you, and I'll just jump in here to also say that for me, a lot of research projects start out as a question, which is unsurprising that I had my students start out with a research question, because I think in those terms. And so following these like 9/11 memoirs, I was really curious about aesthetics and form. Like, did the condition of exile, forced migration, the being torn from one's homeland, whether that was, forced exile or self-imposed exile, did that have an impact or effect on the form of the memoir? Was it a traditional memoir? Was it perhaps maybe fragmented in some way? Like, how was the form or the aesthetic impacted by the nature of the writer? And so it kind of started out that way, and it's turned into a few different articles and explorations. This is why I love working, for instance, on Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, because she, visually and, textually shows us in Persepolis, the graphic memoir, what life was like in revolutionary Iran, and then in, post-revolutionary Iran abroad, and then and upon her return. And she actually looks at themes of fragmentation, homelessness, alienation. These are all themes I'm really interested in. And so love to see that with these writers. So, okay, cool. I really appreciate you all chiming in terms
Okay. Real
Oh yeah,
quick.
go for it. Sorry.
That's okay. I just have a slightly different approach, I think, than some folks, because I went to schools that were very heavy. The text is primary and everything else is secondary. So I was a trained, like, almost aggressive close reader. from pretty early on. So for me, I tend to approach research backwards. I like break down the text and kind of figure out what I think first. I don't really start with a question. I really kind of start more with the characters who won't shut up and like, what do I find interesting about them? So it's one of the things why I wrote a whole master's thesis on the wife of Bath and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. I mean, she's like this character I wanted to go have a beer with at a pub at some point, like, but it was just, so I tend to, do that. And then when I do research, I tend to start somewhat with the bigger, kind of some bigger names that you sort of hear, but then also one of the things I found the best is to find a source that I respond to, like, or one that I think has kind of had uses a similar lens as myself, and then look at the research that they have done. Look at their bibliography, look at their endnotes, their footnotes, things like that. I kind of I kind of call it footnote tracing, right? Where it's sort of like, especially in medieval literature, somebody writing an article in 1926 was like new and revolutionary. So, just kind of find out what's out there, because it's really is impossible for you to do all of the research yourself. So you kind of stand on the shoulders of people who have like waded in before you. And to find those other articles and then to really see the research kind of like I do the literature, where I'm in conversation with the critics. So that's why I also sort of when I think about a lit review, for me, I also work backwards. So I don't think about it like, I'm showing you the research I've done. I'm showing you the conversation I had with these researchers while we were talking about the same thing, if that makes sense. So whether, I'm agreeing with a critic or disagreeing with a critic, or I'm seeing different nuances of what they wrote about versus what I'm looking at, or like maybe they saw a different gap that I'm not concentrating on, and I'm just letting you know, I know it's there, but that's not what I'm focusing on. Those kinds of things. So that's sort of how I go about it in my own work, and somewhat how I consider students to do is like, if there's always a question, if you're always stuck, go back to the literature, right? It's in there. It just, you kind of have to talk to it a little more, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, and just apologies for I lost track of where who I was calling and whatnot, but you did mention the literature review, and that does come up a lot in this class and in research in general. Like, okay, what is a literature review? How do you go about it? What do you think it is? So you touched on that a little bit. Do other folks here want to talk about their experiences with a literature review and like what that is and the function it serves, perhaps, or like how you do it, if you will?
I can. So a literature review for me is context. Not only is it like grounding theoretical frameworks that have implications on my work. So for instance, maybe I'm studying linguistic bands at home. Right now, I just did a qualitative study on CCSD experiences, and this phenomenon came up that sometimes teachers ban first language use at home with parents who speak dual languages, like English at home. This wasn't really the focus of the research. The research really just was like, what are experiences in CCSD? And this came up. So now I have to go back, and my kind of grounding research is then in linguistic justice and linguistic research. What does that look like? So it starts there. It also starts thinking about like critical race theory and the intersections of identity and education and race and class and all of those things. So it starts there, but then it also kind of expands more into what is all the information that I need to cover this particular topic effectively. So then I have to start researching all of the, subjects related, the various themes that come up in my research. All of that is important. And then they will also return back in my discussion section of my research. So I think that that's kind of the literature review. Is like the short version is it is context for the rest of your paper. When we talk about it in composition classrooms, we think about it as like the background information, right? The information that you need in order to understand this is where I'm coming from, not only the theories that inform my text, but also all of the conversations, as Dr. Scherer was saying, that are already happening out there in the world, because we don't start these conversations because nobody's talking about them. They're being talked about elsewhere. So we're trying to find all that information and say, here's where everything kind of connects, but here's what they're not talking about. Here's this gap in research, and that's what I'm trying to fill.
Mhm. Yeah, we love that. We love whenever we can fill a gap, but it's okay also, students, if you're not filling a gap and you're showing mastery too. Like at this level too, of course, like we love to try to fill a gap, but thinking about the content and the context, I love how you phrase that. And I have to say, Dr. Scheer, I think you'll know exactly where I got this from. When you said, you know, kind of the conversations that folks are having, it reminded me of kind of an image I have in my own head in the literature review, because I think about the discourse of what has been written in a book. And I had this image very early on planted in my head from the They Say, I Say book that we both teach from, where they talk about, you know, what they say and then now what I say in terms of rhetorical moves and thinking about writing. But something that they brought up, it was a really great analogy, was like, think about these theorists and these conversations as like folks sitting with you around a table in a cafe, right? And you're there and you're talking about, for me, for instance, it might be like Edward Said and Orientalism and some sort of book that relates to that. And so like, what would these scholars around this coffee table or this cafe table, who are actually the who's who in my lit review, like what would they be saying and how would they be interacting and what would I be adding on to it? And so I really love this visual of thinking about all my folks in the lit review as just like hanging out at a cafe with me. And maybe some are coming in the beginning of the conversation and they're hanging out, right? Those are the top paragraphs of your lit review. And then they leave and other folks come in and that might be in the middle of the lit review. And then you're left with like the last people standing where you're like, yeah, these are my homies. These are the ones that I probably, you know, like hang out with the most, and I'm gonna like bring them in. I don't know. I kind of think of it that way. Like you just kind of set
Yeah.
the scene.
Layla, can I add to
There's always the one where they're like, who invited Phil? You're like, "Ugh,
Yeah.
you got to talk about him because everybody like talks about him, you know."
Right, like who invited this guy? We totally agree with this, and why we're gonna go
I
on
know,
this.
Brie, I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No, you're totally good. I was gonna say, I have, and Joe knows this because I did it in my freshman class. But I have my freshmen when they're thinking about like discourse communities and like thinking about sources as a conversation, I make them actually draw out a house party and like have their sources be different people in that house party, and like who would be hanging out in the kitchen with who would be like throwing hands out in the patio, like because then it not only starts thinking about like you're a real person behind this screen and like attached to this text, but it also gets you thinking about this as like a broader conversation.
Yeah, I think that is also part of what helps combat some of the imposter syndrome that comes with like, who am I to sit here and talk about Edward Said or whoever it is? Like you know, you get so entrenched in the alphabet soup after people's names that you kind of forget. So I always encourage students to like, look, you don't have to, it's okay to reinvent the wheel, right? It is okay. If you trust me, even I, you know, am not thinking I'm going to say anything necessarily new about Chaucer because people were writing about Chaucer like while he was still alive. So like, you know, I'm not going to necessarily write about anything new. That's when Dr. P is talking about we love a gap, because when we see a gap, we're like, woohoo. But it might be a gap that someone else has already seen, but you kind of want to explore that more, or you find it really interesting, but it kind of comes across often in the criticism as like a niche thing, but you're like, no, this should be more important, right? We should really talk about this. Or maybe you have an interesting personal POV, sort of as Dr. Vargas talking about, well, what happens when, you know, you're a person whose identity was not even factored in to what the criticism was at that time, and you're reading this literature and what does it mean to you as a reader and as a scholar to sort of think about these things, but think about them not let them off the hook, if you will. So it's one of the reasons why I study Chaucer so much is he was released from a rape charge, and I don't let him off the hook. We talk about this, and because so much of his work is about consent and sexuality and dubious consent, and you can almost see what his work was like before and what it was like after, and you have to kind of talk about all of these things. So you have these female characters that are ventriloquized by a male character, male author, talking about all of these things. And some of them are female characters ventriloquized by male characters written by a male author. It gets very confusing. But ultimately it's asking those questions, and then if you can kind of knock the authors and the critics and stuff off their pedestals just a little bit, it gets a little bit easier to write about them, because then you're not like, oh, I'm not. And also the people that I write about are very dead. They're not going to come find me. They've been gone like 800 years. Like, I'm not going to get into Twitter war with Chaucer. Like, it's fine. So he hasn't haunted me yet, even after all this time. So it's just that's the part where it's thinking about it that way. It's not, you don't have to be gentle with them. You can, really ask these questions and sort of wade into the conversation, sort of like you would with a group of strangers at a party, right? You might be hesitant at first, but a lot of times you just kind of like, okay, wow, they said something I really want to talk about. So you just sort of start talking to them, and then that kind of finishes it. And then you're probably not going to solve the problem after you leave. Sort of like in composition, Bree and everyone else who teaches composition, I tell my students, you're not going to solve racism in America in 5 to 7 pages. You're just not. So like, what was the conversation before you got there? What do you want to say while you're there? And how do you want to make your exit? Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Varga, Professor Hoover, anything you guys want to add about lit review or some other related?
I mean,
I'm sorry, y'all. My son just grabbed the hot dogs and cackled and ran off. So
I think I'll just speak a little bit more to like the process of it, because I think a lot of what you've said, like I would echo around entering a conversation and trying to speak to like the arguments in those conversations and like what scholars have found, right? But I really struggle with being overwhelmed by all of the information. I actually really dislike the literature review. It's probably my least favorite part of the process. So I just encourage you all to pursue multimodal ways of approaching your earliest process work. So I love Padlet when I'm working on just an overview of a conversation or working on a lit review or something that will become a lit review. I really just like taking my articles and putting them in Padlets and having excerpts from those articles and identifying pages that are really important to me and having images around them and like little videos to myself, because I just find the really traditional way of approaching a literature review to be really terrifying. So I just want to throw that out there, that there's definitely, as long as you get to the product, right, of that review, that's going to precede the work that you are doing. That's really all that matters. How you get there is up to you. And as a creative myself, I feel like being artistic helps with my feelings of unease and anxiety.
Awesome. That's awesome.
Go
advice.
Padlet. They should pay me.
Yeah.
They should pay me lots of money.
Yeah. Professor Varga, did you want to add anything about the lit review, or should we move on?
I mean, I do similar things as Emily. I do a lot of diagramming, Venn diagrams and tables. And sometimes doing an annotated bibliography for myself really helps, just in terms of figuring out how each article relates to my research. But the lit review is often a very messy, nebulous process. And so, yeah, I love Emily's approach to using a Padlet for it and just being very creative and multimodal about it. I think that's wonderful.
And I encourage my honors thesis students to do that too, or do Google Docs or do
Yeah.
whatever they need to do. Like, sure, I can make sense of it, but that's not really what matters. What matters is if you can make sense of it, and then I'm going to see maybe more of that later on when I look at your artifacts.
Right. No, it makes sense. So we only have 10 minutes left, so I think this will be a great time to pause for questions. And then, if there aren't any, I have another follow-up question to ask, but questions from students on Zoom, if you'd like to write them in the chat or just unmute your mics, that's totally fine. And our dear students in the room. Okay, we've got a hit. We've got a question online. So this is for anyone. When working on a project, does the project ever stop speaking to you? Does the inspiration, motivation, obsession, passion disappear? What do you do at that point? Shelf it for later? Power through to some resolution? Love this question. Yeah, it's an awesome
I
question.
think we've all gotten sick of ourselves and the project at some point. Once I finished my dissertation, like I didn't really want to, I didn't look at it again for like 3 years. But that's kind of a 4-year project. I think something like the honors thesis is so go, 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 go that you don't quite have as much of a chance to get sick of it. But yes, there will be times when you have to kind of put something aside for a little while and come back to it again. I always recommend too, if you're in the editing process too, to put things down and pick them back up, just because you'll see a lot more and a lot differently. But yes, be prepared to be sick of it every so often.
I'll also say that, like, wow, that's absolutely true. Like, I can't even read from my chapbook that came out a couple years ago. It's like, I feel like it's my Smells Like Teen Spirit and I just don't want to perform it, you know? So I feel that as an artist, but I will say that, like, I think the beauty of a Nevada State education is that you have so many different ways that you are learning. You could look at a topic through a writing studies lens, through a literary studies lens, right? Through a creative lens. So shelving for sure, taking that break for sure, but you never know when that project, that obsession will come back, maybe just in a different way or through a different discipline. So if it's something where your heart really is, you can return to it again and again and again after those very necessary breaks.
Yeah, and I think related to that might be working on more than one project at the same time. And I know sometimes some people don't, you're discouraged from doing that, but I found that helps me when I can turn my attention to, if I'm tired of something, I can turn my attention to something else for a while and then go back to the first project. Or maybe I see something or I hear something, I watch a documentary or I read another text, and that really somehow my brain relates it to the project that I'm working on. So I don't know, sleeping on it is a good thing. Sometimes, but not giving up, I think, is also good, especially when you're bored with it.
Also,
So,
be prepared, to
yeah.
be inspired about it at the most random times. I cannot tell you the number of times I figured out what I wanted to say about something while I was in the middle of washing my hair in the shower.
Yeah.
And I got to the point where I would have to like get out of the shower to like write it down, because you want, but basically write it down immediately. If you have to have like a notebook beside your bed so that you were dreaming about it and you wake up and you write it down, because if you think you're going to remember, you won't. So, but yes, it's just one of those times when like it's going to hit you at completely random times, like, holding a bottle of olive oil in the grocery store and you'll be like, ha. That's why it's great that phones now have note apps, and because back in the day they did not. So but definitely write it down the minute that it comes to you, because your brain's always kind of subconsciously working on it, even if you're not conscious of the fact that it's doing that, and you will have those random hits at the strangest times.
Which is why I recommend to my students working on your project at least 15 minutes every day. That's it. It could just be 15 minutes, but if you hit it every day, then it's like in the subconscious. So that way you're out, you're doing things and you're like, oh, this is the connection I'm going to make. I don't know. I'm a big believer in that and getting the project done.
And I think that also goes for the literature review, especially if you don't have deadlines. Like if you're not in a class where you have to meet goals at certain times, just giving yourself, if you can, 5, 10, 15 minutes a day to just look at whatever articles you've bookmarked or maybe if it's a really current topic, what's coming out, you know, and just trying to stay in the conversation, but not allowing it to rule your life, you know?
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
can be very difficult, especially again, when you're not in a class, because you're like, I have to do this thing, but no one's telling me I do. So now I'm gonna overdo it and burn myself out.
So staying in the conversation, but not letting it take over your life.
Mhm.
I love that. That's a really good. That and the house party of the
Yeah.
literature review
Stealing
folks
that.
hanging out like that.
Stealing that for
I'm just
102.
imagining construction paper, crayons, like I want to draw this thing out. I
So
love it.
good.
Who's hanging out? Who's hanging out in the kitchen,
know.
rolling with the homies or something like that?
Who's up in the like the parents' like bedroom, you know, all
Yeah.
that, yeah, all those other things.
I don't know. Questions for you guys? Questions that you can think of?
Joe actually has a question in the chat that I was actually going to address from the last question. So if I could answer that one, I will.
Do you mind just reading it so that the people in
Yeah.
the can
So Joe asks, when it comes to analyzing profound subjects or topics, how do you stay sane throughout the dedication? Please ignore my cat. So I was thinking about this when you all were talking about taking breaks. Because for those of us that study, you know, situations that often deal with marginalized communities, I wonder if Layla, if you feel the same with post-colonial lit, like it gets challenging. You know, when you're constantly talking to people about negative experiences that they've had, it gets very hard on your mental health, and you see that kind of manifesting in different ways in your own personal life, and that gets really challenging too. So you have to take breaks. You have to give yourself that time to kind of decompress and to really kind of understand the experiences that you're studying. Again, please ignore him. So you have to take those breaks, and you have to find joy in your own personal life. Otherwise, you absolutely will like just lose control of what you're thinking about, because it's constantly on your mind, right? So you have to take those breaks, but you also have to prioritize yourself. That also kind of connects back to the previous question, and like, you know, when do you find that passion again? So something happens like a presidential election or a experience that you have where you hear a new injustice, and that will unexpectedly spark those creative juices again and remind you like, this is why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because we're trying to fight back against this thing that we're seeing in the world right now. So I just wanted to kind of answer that.
So my scholarly work is in rape culture, which means a lot of my research means that I get to read rape narratives. And especially female saint hagiography and a lot of that stuff. I remember having in the course of my research to read about the Kosovo War in Kosovo and Bosnian soldiers and the way rape is used in, you know, as a tool of war and oppression and power, you know, and power dynamics, and also used to trick the, you know, people into thinking it's the invading army when in fact it was their own army, using the uniforms and televising it of the enemy. So, and I just, you have to be prepared to just be angry. At some point you're going to be angry, and thinking about those things, and even of course it's like there was a presidential election, you say, Bree. But even in the course of all of that sort of stuff, I find that you have to yes, do something that you enjoy, but also do something that helps funnel that. So like randomly for me, I enjoy watching action films where things blow up. Like people get, you know, or you know, horror films, various things where it's just like, you know, it's somewhat silliness, but I kung fu movies like where people get punched a lot, like, it's like, but yeah, no, it's just one of those things where you kind of have to find whatever the silly thing is that that you can do to sort of decompress. Some people go on walks, some people do various other things, but you kind of have to, because it can blindside you if you're not expecting it, but you kind of have to realize when it's time to put the book down, because you're so angry, you're not even processing. So you kind of have to put the book down and go do something else. And that's sort of where you have to try to find your sanity, but you kind of also have to be prepared for the anger, because you will be angry. So yeah, it's hard to read those things. But yeah, to think about the fact that we're still asking the questions in the same way that an author like Chaucer was writing about them is also part of that basis of rage too. It's like, have we really come so little in all that time? And so that's part of it.
Well, we're at our time. I don't want to keep you all. Did you guys have a burning question? Yeah, no? Okay, thank you. Thank you, faculty.
Everyone.
Thank you, students, student participants and future students watching, and of course, faculty online, faculty here. I appreciate all of you. I love working with you. I feel like we're just an awesome, program and department, but I really will tell you, students, and again, future students watching this, like, you're in the best set of hands, like whichever faculty member you choose to work with, whether it's in a class, whether it's on an honors thesis or something like that. Like, this is really an awesome department, and everybody has such a great collegial presence. So I appreciate you all taking time and being here. Thank you so much. And I guess hope to see you guys soon in person. So, okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.